Welcome to Lynn's Warriors, where truth meets courage and action leads the way. Today we are honored, completely honored by Frank Russo, a dedicated advocate and expert in the fight against human trafficking. Frank has spent years working on the front lines, exposing the dark networks that profit from human suffering and helping survivors reclaim their freedom and dignity. Frank Russo is a veteran legal strategist, advocate, and thought leader in the fight against human trafficking and criminal justice reform. He currently serves as director of the CPAC's Foundation Center for Combating Human Trafficking. He also supports survivors there. He's driving legislative actions and policy solutions in addition to his role at CPAC. He is the Georgia State Director for Right on Crime, a national criminal justice initiative, and also works with Modern Fortis, a strategic advocacy firm. The website, I'm going to give you CPAC, everybody, cpac.org. Don't worry, because Frank has so many credits, it'll all be in the body of the video and different links that you can follow along. Take your time and read all about this most important work. I'm going to say, Frank, you got me tongue-tied because you have so much going on in your life. I can't even say it, but welcome Frank Russo to the Warriors.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Lynn. And I like to joke that I have as many job titles as I do children these days. So it's every time I get a new kid, we have to make sure we have more work to do. And my wife loves that. We keep moving in a positive direction. And just wanted to thank you for having me on. Your partnership in this fight, your leadership, and it's not just blowing smoke, it's the reality. It's needed at this time, probably now more than ever, because we've got an opportunity over the next 3.5 years to make an impact that we just haven't seen really in the last half decade.
Now, Frank, I'm a pretty tough warrior, but don't make me cry because those words mean so much to me. They really touch me. I really think together, true collaboration. We hear that word a lot, Frank. Collaboration. We're going to come together. I don't see it. I see a little bit. We have to do a better job of roping those in, really doing the work, and really coming to the forefront. And I know it's hard today because there's so much going on. The public tells me it's like they're getting hit with a hammer every day over the head. Something's popping up. We both know people are busy trying to, take care of kids, pay the mortgage, pay the car payment, put food on the table. It's hard to focus on this, in my opinion, number one crime happening across America. Nobody is exempt from this exploitation happening even at our kitchen tables because of devices. But let's before we get into all of that, I want to ask you something, Frank.
Yeah.
Give us a little tidbit, as we say, spill a little tea, as we like to say, Warriors. What do you want to tell us about yourself? It could really be anything, where you grew up, anything you want to talk, before we get into trafficking, exploitation. Who is Frank Russo?
I appreciate that. And let me just say, I want to pick up on one thing you said that's so valuable. Our enemies are team working. They are collaborating. They are fighting to cause harm in our communities. We have no choice. We have to trust each other and we have to collaborate, because it sounds simple, but it goes back to our kids. The bad guys are. So we've got to beat them. So I'm grateful that you brought up the point about collaboration, because it's so vital, but maybe it'll tie a little bit into my background. So I've kind of came to this fight in a unique way. I had a chance to serve on Capitol Hill, the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. And in those roles, we got firsthand experience with the policy that impacts survivors, that assures and gives tools to our prosecutors and law enforcement to actually go after these bad guys. And then, most importantly and most challengingly, as you've experienced, to go after big tech when they don't act appropriately either. And so I spent a couple of years working in that side of the world, and then stepped off Capitol Hill in government and went right into private practice, representing exactly those law enforcement voices that are vital in this fight. So I spent over half a decade representing state and local prosecutors, working with the prosecution side of the field that needs to actually hold the bad guys accountable, big tech accountable, and can ensure that survivors actually get justice. And in that process, I found, what you have experienced and so many of your guests before this have found, there are a lot of folks who are just not getting that justice. They're not getting the trafficking, supporters, the trafficking enablers, I like to say, behind bars. Very infrequently do we even get the traffickers behind bars. And all too often, survivors end up behind bars. And so that work kind of shocked me. And that led me to entering the political arena a little bit, rejoining the team at the Conservative Political Action Coalition, better known as CPAC. And in that work, I had a real good opportunity. We had done a lot in the public safety realm, a lot in the building trust in the justice system realm, but something was missing. And I always felt that. And alongside one of my personal heroes, Mercedes Schlapp, we had an opportunity to screen the Sound of Freedom movie well before it was really publicly out there. And we kind of took a leap of faith to show that movie to members of Congress, to legislators, to their staff, to people in Washington, D.C., all the high power, high profile people. And the number of tears, if you've seen that movie or if you're familiar with the trafficking work more at large, that left that room, and the motivation to actually do something led us to say, well, we've got to take a step in the right direction in this fight. So in 2023, we founded our Center for Combating Human Trafficking, really on a whim. It was myself, Mercedes, and we dragged some staff who also had 2 other job titles along. And in that process, over the last 3 years, we have been focused specifically on how do we make an impact on legislation? How do we get this message to the public, which is so vital? And then how do we work on that collaboration? CPAC has a unique platform. We have a conference every year many people are familiar with. We have tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people who come through that. We've got millions of views online. Do we have a platform that can lift this issue up? And I think the answer was yes. So that last piece is, how do we collaborate with partners like yourself who are so much forward and leading in this fight, who've been in this fight for so long? And how do we give our platform in the right direction to lift up that work? And I think that's what we've been doing for the last 3 years. And now I think one of the cool things about my 5 crazy titles is I also get to go back and work directly with law enforcement and hear with directly from what they need, what they're missing, what tools do they not have. And then lastly, I get to work with survivors and represent survivors directly, whether it's things like ensuring they get pardons, ensuring that there are laws on the books that protect them. I just get to do the full gambit. I like to say I represent every part of the justice system now. So I get to be held responsible for all the problems, and boy, are there a lot.
I don't know, Frank. All I know is I mentioned earlier to you before we started, when I mentioned your name, everybody loves you. So it's like, I say, go for it. Utilize that. Go for everything. Keep your strength up. Take your vitamins. I want to go back, and you mentioned Sound of Freedom. I want to share with you that it opened here in New York, as I recall, on the 4th of July. And I remember I couldn't wait to go to the local theater. And I went. But Frank, I always look at an audience, like, focus groups. That's always what and when that movie was done, and they ran some things at the end, like, when it stopped, credits and just different. I remember, I think they had some, I don't know, maybe some paragraphs of information and things. Nobody got up out of their seats. The theater was sold out, by the way. Nobody got up. And that to me told me they were like overcome. I saw some people crying. You don't see that in New York. And then I started getting all the phone calls, like people were just in disbelief in the theater. And then I started getting texts, the phone calls. Oh, Lynn, you were right. There is trafficking. But I would say, and it's happening in America because the film was based not on America. So, but I got more reaction out of that film where people saying, I didn't know, I didn't understand. And so people are visual is what I'm saying. So I think we have to, in this realm of trafficking, we have to do a better job of offering perhaps, Frank, visuals for people. Because, it's like online. People, do you ever see how they put so many likes on pictures and things like that? But you might put a vetted study, you get 5 likes. You put a picture, you get 5,000 likes. So we got to go where it is, and give them what they're going to understand. So we've got to, I'm just throwing this in. I just thought of that. We have to have some more visual, tidbits, sound bites, documentaries, things of that nature to really get the public on board. Because that's all I think about 24/7, getting the public on board. Frank, I want to go over something on bouncing off of that a little bit. You're at the forefront, obviously, national efforts, and we thank you for that. We need you. I'm so happy we've met. We're going to collaborate. You've got energy, again, which is infectious, makes me want to work harder. For those who still think that we are exaggerating, because I've been faced with people telling me I'm lying, I'm making it up, fear-mongering, just explain the landscape for the warriors listening, really how widespread in America. Let's do that right here in our own backyards, as most say. It's really in every community, town, city across America. Explain that a little bit.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. I think the Sound of Freedom movie was great, but it was a gateway into what is an issue that we already knew so much about, which is, although it's horrible that this problem is unfortunately an international problem, it starts here domestically. I like to say often, I had a great chance to testify before Congress. It may be an international crime, but we need an American solution. And the reason is because it's an American problem too. What we find with trafficking is that a majority of our victims, there was a great study that said a majority of those arrested, even at the ports of entry for trafficking related offenses federally, were American citizens.
Yes.
So not just the victims, but the traffickers themselves reside here in the United States. That doesn't mean that we need to sit and be afraid of these folks. It means we have the tools. The beauty of our justice system is we can hold people accountable. We can put criminals in jail and make sure that the ones that are dangerous to our communities remain there. So we've just got to be willing to be all open about the problem existing here. And then it ties a little bit back to your point about tech. Unfortunately, because of tech, yes, you could have international actors involved, but that also means our domestic, abusers and our domestic traffickers are using social media to target our children, to target victims, even male and female adult victims. And so this problem has not, I think the challenge when we explain the trafficking problem and the exploitation problem is the scope. It feels so big that we can't wrap our hands around it. When we talk about it as an American problem, as one that's right here at home, and that the traffickers, the enablers are identifiable, they're arrestable, and we can hold them accountable for a very long time, well, then maybe it's not as big of a problem. Maybe we can actually get our arms around this, because a lot of these traffickers are right here in our communities, and we can take them out of our communities for good.
Yeah, I think, well, you said a mouthful, Frank. And I caught myself sitting in New York City where, it's at the bottom of the totem pole here to really, they're concerned, or as law enforcement has said to me, and we're nothing if we're not truthful in the Warriors. This is the reality. We're going to arrest them, and they're just let out. Therefore, we do nothing. I'm like, you do nothing. So we have to talk about really getting on that path of, and you're the expert with this, holding them responsible. How dare somebody exploit, harm, enslave? Like, I actually think the word trafficking, I call it slavery, because people understand it's the enslavement of people. They think trafficking, I think, Frank, it goes in one ear, out the other. They don't really understand. They think it's the car, the truck, the boat, which it is. But enslavement, we have more people enslaved today in the United States than any other time in history. Like, that gets their attention. But we have to help our law enforcement, which I know you're doing, giving them the understanding, giving them the resources. And that's the part I don't really get. I'm digressing, Frank, right here. But so we know what it is. Give them the resources they need and the training they need to put an end to this and hold those who exploit accountable. If we started seeing this accountability on a mass scale, Frank, would you agree we'd see less of this happening? But these predators seem, to think they can get away with it. So it's just supply and demand, and they don't care about anybody. It's just making money for them.
It is. It goes back to an old adage in crime, which is it's actually not the punishment that drives, the criminal activity. It's the certainty of being caught and held accountable. And right now, there is because the crime itself is never been viewed the appropriate way, which you're right, is slavery. It hasn't been prosecuted the appropriate way in many cases, and it hasn't had the spotlight on it. When you do, you're able to kind of push these traffickers, in a lot of cases, even out of our country, because they understand that it's not just that they're going to get a long sentence, it's that they're more likely to get caught. And one of the reasons I point out, one of the negatives is the way that we didn't do a good job over the last few decades in prosecuting and arresting in these crimes is that the drug trade, the cartels have started to focus on moving humans instead of product. And there's nothing more dangerous than moving a human being. Because a human being can, even though they're often abused heavily, speak up for themselves. Product can't do that. Drugs, fentanyl, they're horrible, but they're not going to go to cooperate with law enforcement. You're talking about people here. You're taking the ultimate risk and committing the ultimate crime, which is slavery. And yet we have done such a poor job of not only shining a spotlight, but being effective and holding these criminals accountable that it's become their number one business driver. And that's how to your point, we have not done a good enough job. It's an over $500 billion industry internationally. It's over $1 billion here in the United States. That is a problem. We have got to do way more on the law enforcement side, and they know this. Now, you do have one-off cases, and we can talk about it, where certain prosecutors or certain elected government officials are part of the problem. We won't shy away from that reality. But in general, law enforcement's on the right side of this issue. We've got to train them up and give them the tools so that when they make these arrests, they put those traffickers away and they make it clear to those next set of traffickers, not only are we going to catch you, we're going to hold you accountable fast. That will drive them out of this industry.
Frank, you brought up a point. We work with law enforcement here, and they have made it very clear to me that the cartels have really, thank goodness things are closed down somewhat on the borders these days. To me, everything's a border, whether it's, up in Canada, the oceans, I just think they're all over the borders. It's not just, people traditionally think of Texas and things like that, but it's really all over that they've been allowed to just infiltrate our country. But law enforcement has told me the cartels are basically using American kids in middle and high schools to traffic their peers, so traffic other American kids, and also deal their drugs. Now, I don't know if you want to speak about that. I've heard about this, but I say, why aren't we in the middle of Times Square here, like screaming? This is just not allowed yet. And I suffer from it because the media wanted me to talk a lot about Diddy. Come and I'll take any opportunity, Frank, and I'll answer any way I see fit. When somebody answers me a question about victims, survivors, flip it on that. But we put so much attention on that kind of low-hanging fruit and the Epstein, right? And we have a horrible case pending right here in New York that nobody's really talking about. This Howard Rubin, who just around the corner from me was torturing women. Horrible. Yet a lot of silence around this one, Frank. But we're not putting all this emphasis or media attention on what I just told you about with the cartels. What do you want to say about that?
Well, it goes back to, it's a high-risk crime. That's what drives me, I think, so crazy about this. Think about this. They're not even trafficking some of those children. They're using those children to engage in the trafficking as the middleman. Again, that is so many points of contact that could then turn and cause those cartels problem. And yet they feel at liberty to use it. I think there's another angle here that you and I have talked about prior to this meeting that is important, which is, where does text roll in this process? Because children are still vulnerable, whether they're being trafficked or whether they're being brought into a trafficking scheme. It is not their fault. We are not going to blame the survivors and victims of these crimes. What we do need to do is start holding and making sure that our tech partners that are hosting these social media sites take the right steps to limit these tools. And then not even just limit these tools, be responsive. We talk about what are tools for law enforcement. That's so high level. But let's be clear. Law enforcement wants access, not to your private personal data. But if you're operating on a platform like Snapchat or on an Apple device or on TikTok, one I don't use and refuse in my household, those are tools to directly message amongst the youth of this next generation to then get them into trafficking networks. You're telling me we can't share that information with law enforcement? Tell me we can't shut down those accounts or track those accounts? I have a hard time believing that's the truth. And I think any of us who've done this work long enough know it's not the truth. So if that information was more easily shared with law enforcement, if there were better tools in place to empower parents to step in and limit these accounts, I think we'd start to see this problem not only get a broader spotlight, but also it goes back to what we just talked about. We'd also be able to find who those trafficking cartels are and root them out, because they're the ones sending that initial message. And we can work up the chain if we know where these social media actors are, but we're not getting this cooperation from our tech partners. And I say partners almost facetiously.
Yeah, partners, you're overstating it, Frank, a little bit, because history has shown, let me make this statement. They're just not willing. Look, we could get into Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Basically, for warriors listening, they know listening to me, that's a billboard for them. They can't be held responsible. They're a newsstand. So why should they do anything until we really sunset that, which there's action right now to deal with that. Finally, I think almost 30 years later, we should be doing something. But we have a great piece of legislation, KOSA, K-O-S-A, the Kids Online Safety Act, that we're working very hard on. And everybody listen up. It is no way invading your privacy. It's to put a duty of care. Let's have big tech be held responsible for once, not the overwhelmed parents and kids. Because like you said, Frank, we're not blaming parents, kids, families. This was just thrown at everybody. And people are doing the best job they can do. But my biggest fear, and it's happening, Frank, is when something is hard and difficult and people are overwhelmed, they close their eyes, they close the door, they don't want to deal with it. And there's where the predators, they count on that and they move right in, right? And they take advantage of our kids who spend sometimes, 9 hours a day. There's so many different studies on everything online, right? Because schools are using online. It's just society. So how do we operate? Because it's not going away, the digital world. We've got to have some guardrails, and we have to hold big tech accountable. It's time, Frank. And I don't understand. It's kind of a big question why that is so hard. Obviously, criminal things are happening to minors. I'd get arrested if I was doing these things out in public, but you can buy drugs on Snap, and kids are dying of fentanyl. So I never understand why any of that is even allowed in the beginning. I just don't get it. Call me wacky, call me dumb. I don't know.
Well, no, I think it's so important that we talk about it for a couple of reasons. And I hate to just talk needs to turn into action here. One is, for the parents that get overwhelmed, and I'm one of them, you have to remember that they're in your household, but that is often used as a scare tactic. I watch on the news. I said this earlier. My wife is always my test point on this. She watches the local news. She'll hear a story about Snap, or the new one's Roblox, which is supposed to be a child's building game that's being, used and abused by traffickers. And yes, you do need to be hyper aware and concerned, but it also puts the power back in your hands. So one thing I would say to parents first is these traffickers are trying to come through these networks, but if you identify them, you have an opportunity to go to law enforcement and be a part of the solution. You have an opportunity to use your voice to speak out, even if your child wasn't harmed in the process. If you know this is happening or you identify it early on, you have a chance to be a part of the solution. So don't just treat it as a fear tactic, treat it as an opportunity to take the upper hand. I think people in this country, one of the great things about it is we want to be a part of our community and we want to improve our community. This is one of the ways we can do it. There are more, I always say this and it sounds cliche, but it's so important. There are more of us on the right side of this issue overwhelmingly than there are on the wrong side. And I think that's something parents, we talk about empowering parents. I agree, there's just too much being thrown at us right now. But you do just being aware that these problems are out there, checking your child's phone, looking for DMs. If you see something suspicious and you say something, you're now part of the solution. You've now built another block to steal Roblox's line in the chain to hold those traffickers and those tech partners accountable. And that leads me to my last point, which is to your question about the tech community. What do we do to hold them? You mentioned some obviously really positive legislation, but I also think it takes the public pushing back. It's all about lawmakers. They wish this issue wasn't political, and in a lot of ways it's not. But I work in the political world, so I don't get to shy away from it. Politics matter. Why are we not passing good bills that would seem to be easy to do, bipartisan, Republican and Democrat? Why are they not getting through? Well, because the political pressure is not there. Politicians respond to yes, money, but they also respond to political pressure. And as parents get more involved and start questioning these Robloxes, these Snaps, all of these broader social media that I'm forgetting a million of, say, why are you not protecting my child on your platform? Why is profit and data sharing more important than the well-being of children? I think the politicians will respond to that pressure. And it just takes us coming together and having not just these conversations, but getting out to rallies, talking to your lawmakers, taking that extra 15 minutes of your day to say, hey, this is a problem here. One of the jokes I like to say is there are great Facebook groups about the abuse that's happening on some of those platforms, including their own. Get on there and speak up and make sure other parents are aware. I try to talk to trained parents in my community, but I use it as an opportunity to also create political incentives so that we get these legislative proposals, and there's quite a few, over the line. Because without policy change, fair or not, we're not actually going to make the big impact on tech. And then I do think there will be some partnership. I think when they're forced to the table, it turns out they also, in many cases, not all, don't want child to be abused on their platforms. Well, great, we'll work with you, but we've got to work with you under fair conditions.
Yeah, and I think, Frank, there is so much hope right now. There are more parents, and I like to say guardians too. We work with a lot of families made up of grandmas raising the kids, older siblings raising, brother. It's just a different dynamic I see a lot of here in New York. But they're waking up. They're interested. And if they don't know, and I'm talking to them, they'll be like, well, what do I do? And we always want to, because we know all of this is not friendly, not nice, what we talk about, but we always want to take action to come from that. We always want to give somebody, I like to call it easy lifting, right? A take action, signing on to something, getting involved in their community, finding a group nearby, following CPAC. There's a lot of great free information online that people can take their time, they can read about, but we need to give it, direct them towards that so they don't shut that door. I want to go back and talk about a little bit about survivors, because we cannot do any of this work. I am not a victim of trafficking, a survivor of trafficking. You're not. But I think when we talk about this work, the first thing that struck me when I started is they have to be at the table for every discussion. They have to be part of telling us, why should I go out and talk about trafficking when I've never been trafficked, other than I'm very passionate. I don't want it to happen. I don't want children and grandchildren affected, anybody's, right? Fill us in about this survivor world a little bit, because I do see it strengthening a little more lately, a little more empowering. I have to say, I think we need to do a lot more of that, giving them more platforms, more resources. Because when I found out, Frank, in the beginning, somebody came ended up in New York with a trafficker, dumped in the streets, didn't speak English. Somebody gave them the name of an organization. I'm not going to name names or anything. And was telling me the story. They were given, a $25 gift card to Target and told to take a subway train like way out in our borough. So like way outside of New York City. Okay, I'm just using that as this example, but that's horrible. I mean, that is not the way we treat people. I think we have to do better by that. And I do hear from a lot of, survivors, and I like to call them leaders. I don't even like that word, victims, survivors, I'm always like a little hesitant with that because they're really leaders, and they're helping us. What should we be doing right now? It's 2025 with them because we need them at the table. They are coming to the table. I think we need to do a better job, though. What do you think?
I am so glad you brought it up, and I think it's the most valuable piece of this. And I always like to say, one of the trainings that I always try to take is to be trauma informed, because these survivor leaders, they are leaders, but they have also been through something so horrific that they're even willing to come out and talk about it. Is a bravery that I think it's hard for a lot of us to comprehend. And so I always start with, and again, it may sound cliche, but it's the truth. The first thing we need to do is listen to them. We have got to, and I make sure that at CPAC, we're so lucky, and even with my other partners, whether it be Right on Crime or at our firm in the law enforcement, we try to let survivors, not like you said, lead, but I also say drive a lot of the policy conversations, because there are parts of this story that we don't understand where maybe our justice system has failed them. And many times it has. And so we try to work with these survivors in a way that we listen to them, and then we turn that policy thoughts and their experience into action where appropriate. And I actually talk about where the positives are. I think this is one of the places we're making significant progress. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we've seen at the state level, not just the federal level. One, to abandon myself from being too directly connected to the swamp. I used to live in Washington. I spent 10 years there. I try to hide that. I'm thankfully now back in the great state of Georgia. But one of the things that we've seen even here in Georgia is a significant effort to focus on how the criminal justice system treats survivors. And here's the uncomfortable part that we have dealt with for decades, which is a lot of survivors end up being criminalized for the crimes of their traffickers. Yeah. What does that mean? Traffickers know that they are exploiting vulnerabilities. So it's not just the sex work conversation you hear or prostitution or all these. They force these survivors to commit other crimes, whether it be financial crimes, retail theft. It is a real problem. And so what comes next? Well, when that survivor gets picked up, the trafficker can say, well, I never committed a crime. They did. And that's where we have a big problem in this country. So what's being done about it? We have seen in states across this country, including I would call them blood red conservative states, an effort to do what's called a Survivor Justice Act, whether it's domestic violence, child exploitation, or human trafficking. If you can directly relate what you've been committed or accused of committing a crime for to the fact that you were trafficked, abused, or exploited, then you're not the one who goes to jail. And oftentimes we also allow this law to work for people who are already in jail, but know their traffickers are still out on the streets. And so we've got some great cases. Oklahoma passed this recently. Here in Georgia, the great Peach State passed this. And Texas, the governor just signed this, I think it was a month ago, where these survivors are now getting out of the justice system, whether it be on the front end or the back end. And you know what they're doing, which is, again, we talk about the bravery of it all. They're now working with law enforcement to identify, the actual trafficker and put those individuals in jail. And it goes back to what I said, certainty of being caught. Nothing works in a trafficker's favor better than if a survivor is criminalized or punished for the crimes of the trafficker. Why? Because it means they're not going to get caught. Someone's already been prosecuted for the crime. We need to create an environment where survivors are given resources and tools to be successful, yes, but that the justice system respects them and the way that it should have from the start, and goes after those traffickers in a way that and that's what law enforcement wants. It puts those cartels out of business, and it puts survivors on the fast track to success.
Yeah, I love hearing all that and letting our warriors know there is action there, that we are. And that whole thing around survivors, when we talk to people and we do these groups, and we like to call them salons here in New York. We just sit around with the public and kind of let them Q&A type thing. They don't really understand, they'll say, oh, why don't they just run away? Why? They don't understand another program, Frank, but trauma, vulnerability, being drug addicted, being scared, being beaten down psychologically. So there's so much work in that area. But as you pointed out, I am seeing a lot of movement lately, with all of this, which makes a lot of hope, and it's so good for all of this. And we have to keep on that and never forget about the survivors of this and putting them, at the head of the table and giving them a position and helping them with resources. I have to ask you, Frank, because I'm on this new role of, I personally got a lot of pushback in New York. We are associated, the Warriors, with a lot of coalitions and groups, right? And I would always say during meetings, let's bring men to the table. I would say because we need to have men who support women and show there are good men out there. And we also know from our work with law enforcement, I can state what's going on in New York City. Boys now are highly in demand and bringing in more money than girls for sex trafficking. So let us bring, and I got tremendous and still get tremendous pushback. Let's talk about the role of men in all of this. What would you like to say? It's a big question. I think we need our boys. Let's be realistic, Frank. I can't be talking to teenage boys. Like, we need men to step up and mentor with them, and we need dads to understand. Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought it up because it goes back to the start of our conversation. This is unfortunately an evil-led crime. Let's not make any mistake about it, but it's also a profit-driven crime, which means they're not interested, these criminal traffickers, in gender. They're interested in what drives profit. And unfortunately, that means men and boys, and I say boys too, because they're, like you said, teenagers and young children in many cases are also being abused. And what happens is because of the stigma around, and we all grew up with it. I did. And I grew up in sports. I grew up in this lifestyle in the South where you're not supposed to talk about emotions, feelings, etc. But those are just as exploitive as it is for females and young women and young men. And so the challenge we've got is not just to lift up the voices of survivors generally, but to make sure that, like you said, men are at the table in two capacities. First, as survivors. There is a large survivor community of folks who've been abused both in at a younger age, but also in adulthood. You mentioned it's hard to talk about. People look the other way. How could an adult male ever be? It's always the conversation. How could they ever be trapped in this situation? It's easy to say when your family hasn't been threatened or you haven't been abused, in a way that your drug addiction has been exploited. It's very easy to sit here and say, well, how could that happen to you? Especially for the males in this story. And the reality is exploitation is exploitation. Taking advantage of people's weaknesses is unfortunately been a part of this crime through the centuries. And so what do we do next? We lift up the voices of male survivors, but then we bring in, a diverse coalition, and not in the DEI way, and the way that we work with folks who have entirely different backgrounds across the country, who either have worked in law enforcement, who are survivor leaders, are advocates like we are. And we put them in the room together and we talk about what were the weak points. How did they get to this community? How did they get to these young men and take advantage of them at a time when they otherwise you wouldn't think, either sometimes physically they shouldn't have been taken advantage of. What those weak points are? How do we identify those? How do we create tools to make sure that we support those young men and boys in that situation? And then how do we help law enforcement identify it? Because to your point, that stigma also crosses across the criminal justice system lines. Again, law enforcement are going to have a hard time believing an able-bodied male was taken advantage of, but it happens, and it happens for the exact reasons we just said. And it's once we're able to identify it, once we're able to work with those individuals and those survivor leaders, then again, it becomes a whole heck of a lot easier to identify those traffickers and put them behind bars.
Yeah, because I was doing a lot of reading and I've been talking to a lot of men, and it's always that, man up, act like a man, don't kind of thing. And I'm also, Frank, hearing, and it disturbs me, as the mother of, men now, this male toxicity or something. They're calling men and boys toxic, like they're kind of labeling them. And they're talking that goes into, the internet with these incel groups, these online rage groups. I feel like they're trying to put stickers on boys, which will further isolate our boys. That right now it's coming to, we're seeing a lot of things happening with boys and young men that are not very good, whether we've seen a spate of shootings and just a lot of these groups like Tate Brothers with this rageful kind of actions. You have anything to say about that? Because I don't like labeling, that kind of label on boys.
I couldn't agree more. And I've got two young boys and it is, and I've grown up in this culture. What I will say is, and you see it in the crime space more generally, we're seeing younger and younger criminals as well, who are pushed into this life, and usually they're all male. And I think the answer is we have got to create societal structures that support success for what it looks like for men. The same way we need to create those same structures for women. Women want to succeed in the workplace. We want to be a part of that. If men want to take traditional or untraditional career paths, we have to support that too. And that's a message. We talk about the parents' role in all this. We talk about the school's role. We didn't really go too far into that, but I think it's valuable here. We have got what every study shows is when you take somebody, and especially young men, and put them on a path or trajectory to something that benefits their career. See a lot in the trade profession right now. There's a real resurgence of putting men into trade schools. The success rates of avoiding crime, avoiding exploitation go through the roof. So it's actually really, again, not that complicated. We have to just work with our, younger generations to say, what do you want? It sounds so cliche, but it's so bad. What do you want to be when you grow up? I actually ask this question all the time. I think it annoys some of the people I work with. What do you want to be to grow up, and what are we doing to get you there? And it doesn't need to be, well, that's too toxic. That's just, you don't want to be a typical male, do something else. It can't be that. It needs to be, what do you want to be? Here are the options available, and let's push you in that direction. Because again, then you take away those exploitation factors. When someone's successful, when they're on a path where they're in touch with what they believe, and it may be playing sports, it may be welding, it may be something like working on cars. That takes away, they'd rather be doing that than being exploited, I can tell you that. And we've got to create those tools back into our school systems and back into our society where we're being successful in pushing young men towards the profession and futures that they want, not the ones that we create as some societal structure out of some think tank, out of some university. We actually need to ask the question, and we're not doing that.
To all that, I say amen. Because I've always said, kids are not, to go back a little bit, one size fits all. School doesn't work for some kids, in high school and all that. So if they were geared towards, the trades, which are, as you pointed out, on the upswing, I'm thinking of 2 cases right now where they're flourishing and making a ton of money. And they were the worst, like in high school, and they were being pushed by parents to go to college and all that. And I'm not judging anybody. They couldn't do it. They were failures. They were failing at everything else in life, because they just were so miserable. But once they got involved with trades, one's a plumber. I mean, they're just flourishing. And that's such a wonderful thing to see this happening. But and I know, Frank, when I grew up, if you said somebody's becoming a plumber, they really looked down on that. So somebody's going to become a welder. What's that? This push for college. So I'm happy to see we're opening up to these other things. That's the way it should be. It's kind of the pendulum is swinging back to a long time ago, right? There's sort of nothing new other than the internet in our lives these days. You touched on school. Do you want to say anything else about the education system, which I am extremely disappointed in, with national report cards and everybody basically failing? How can that be in America, Frank? Come on.
Well, it's and I never pretend to be, the academic, education system expert, but I can think it takes any parent to say it's not working. And one of the things you've seen out of this administration and others is what return have we gotten on the investment of something like the Department of Education that was stood up in the 70s? Have the test scores gone up since then? Have the success rate, or has anxiety and medication gone up in that same period? And we all know the answer. So it doesn't mean we tear down institutions. I'm as conservative as they come. You read my background. But it does mean that we need to tweak our institutions again to go back to I say this all the time. People ask me all the time about going to law school. I'm an attorney by trade. And one of the things I say is the worst advice you'll get is don't go to law school unless you want to be a practicing lawyer. I disagree. Don't go to law school unless you want it to advance your career to get to the goal that you set out as a young person, that it gets you to the next step. That's the same in high school. It's the same, really even starting as early as middle school. What do you want to be when you grow up? And how do we get you there? And the education system should not be focused on, yes, literacy is important. It has to be a part of this, but that hasn't been working. A focus on grades and math. Math and STEM are important, but not every student's a math or STEM expert. It's not the grade report cards don't matter. What does that student want to do to be successful? What can we identify as their strengths, and how do we get them to that point? And again, race, background, and socioeconomic status doesn't matter if you set somebody up for success. It matters because we're not asking those students and we're not putting them on a path that's individualized for them. And I recognize that's hard, but what's the point of having an education system if we're not pushing people to the successful careers they want? I just don't understand why we would. What's the value there?
Well, we are. Luckily, this is being addressed, it's being recognized, and people are taking action. I mean, here in New York, Frank, kind of started in that COVID period. I don't like to say that, but that word gets me crazy. I'll leave that. We have seen such an uptick, though, in homeschooling. We've also, in the cities, have seen these teaching pods, where teachers, it'll be a couple of families will hire a teacher and they'll spend their mornings academically and then the afternoons, which I love. They're doing arts, they're doing sports, they're going, I mean, it is New York City, and you can go out to the Met Museum, on your lunch break kind of. But I mean, I love that. And that when the kids have that kind of round it, they do so much better academically. And I talk to the teachers, so they fill me in because I'm not an academic, expert myself. But I like to always ask people like, what's going on? Fill me in, give me the tips, tell me what the kids are saying. So I'm happy to see at least we're addressing, and we have a lot of charter schools. And I see the kids walking with the groups with the and they look so happy. I'm not kidding when I say this, and that makes me happy. So at least we're starting to change the idea. Everybody just goes to this school in the neighborhood. You just do this. You graduate your local high school. You go to college. Boom, boom, boom. That's it. So things are looking up. I like to say hopeful. Frank, tell us about at CPAC right now as director for combating human trafficking. What are you looking at right now? Like what would be your number one thing you want to tell the public about, and maybe how they can get involved and help you with that?
Yeah, I love to end on always the point about what do we do next, and how do people actually get involved in their communities. And I think there's a couple different ways. So at CPAC, I will say, and I always like to plug that we have our major conference coming up in Dallas in March. I would encourage everyone to attend. We do have a trafficking focus both on our main stage and then separately that we'll be involved with. And then I'll also notice I'll be a good soldier and mention that we have a great event in the summer that you were able to join, and we'll do that again on Capitol Hill in July next year. But that's next year. So what do we do in the in-between time? The great news is there is such a need for support in communities. So if you do have the time, there are great survivor homes. There are great volunteer opportunities where you can go, be trained appropriately, and meet with not just the survivors of this crime, but the advocates like yourself who are working on the ground to push both policy change and resource change, helping these individuals. So it's very simple. If you look on any of you use Google and you just look in your state, say, where can I volunteer to support survivors of trafficking? You're going to get a lot of options, and I always encourage people to do that. The second one's actually much easier. We have to be able to talk about this, and we have to be able to talk about this not every time there's an Epstein story on ABC News, or not every time the Diddy trial comes up on a network, elsewhere. We have to be able to talk about this amongst parents. My mom or my wife spends a lot of time in the community with parents with children the same age as we do. I always encourage her, have the conversation about technology and the challenges there. I try to do it with the dads I'm with, and it's not. Yes, it's in between talking football and all the other fun things that we do. But making sure that there's an educational element, again, works because all it takes is one parent to notify or notice that something's wrong within a school. Make sure they get to and target that problem. Maybe get to that child who's been brought in unwittingly into a trafficking network, and now it's out of your school. And now the traffickers know you're looking at your school. Your school administrators involved, the parents are involved, the PTA's involved. You've now created a safe haven yourself, without having to involve law enforcement. And the good news is law enforcement will get involved and many times often identify who that trafficker is. So have these conversations in your household, have them outside of your household, and make sure that you are using your voice to make sure, ask at PTA meetings, ask when you're in your student teacher meetings, look at the social media, use what tools are available, and hopefully more to come, as you said, when we pass these federal laws. But use the tools available to you now to start this conversation, and not in a fearful way. It's not that you're scared. It's not that someone's breaking into your home or going to take your kid out of the car and target. It's not that. Or that even that they're going to come through the cell phone and grab your child. It's that we're on watch. And we as a community have said we're not going to put up with slavery. And our school system, and our school in particular that your children are at, or your home institution, your charter school, we're not going to put up with this. And if you're a trafficker and you come in, we will identify and you will go down. It's that simple.
I like that, Frank. Our Warriors hashtag is community creates change. We believe in the community, the home, the community. And then we also believe, legislative action, those 2 points. I do have to ask you one more thing because it just popped into my head. So I must, Frank. The role of faith and family. You often speak of the importance of this and restoring moral ground or grounding. I've been thinking a lot about this lately. How do those values play into preventing even exploitation before it starts? Because that's where we want to get in, right? Let's be honest, Frank. Are we going to shut down completely well, this is me saying this, not you. We're not going to stop human trafficking in my lifetime. I don't think we are. But what we can do is get in there, intervene, prevent new victims, hold those accountable, and really start getting rid of it. You know what I mean? But we got to start somewhere. So, what do you want to say about the importance of faith?
Yeah, and I'd love to pick up where you ended, which is, it's not to scare people, but we're the Center for Combating Human Trafficking. We're not the Center for Ending Human Trafficking. Unfortunately, and if you're faith driven, this evil will always exist in the world. The evil of man is real, and it's something we work to combat every day. It's why we combat human trafficking. It's not why we end it. So we can't always change evil. There are people who just simply need to be removed from society, and that's why we work with law enforcement. However, faith is, I think, at the core of this, because in many ways, this is both a physical and a spiritual fight. Because the crime itself is evil. It's harming other human beings. It's in the face of everything that God has put in in front of us, and supporting one another, and the golden rule of respecting and treating others how you want to be treated. So what does that mean? I also think that faith communities have to be involved in multiple facets. We talked about the survivors. There's not just the physical restoration for those who face this crime. It's the spiritual restoration, because those individuals, that evil is trying to break those survivors. And we've got to work with those faith-based communities. I often encourage pastors, ministers, others to get, and so many are, but get involved with your survivor centers in whatever way is appropriate to help that spiritual rehealing. And some survivor centers do that as part of their rehab, which is excellent. As a community, though, as broader outside of the survivor space, I think we also need to recenter ourselves on why we do this work. It is a difficult thing to talk about. It's exhausting. I actually tell my staff at CPAC and other people I work with across the spectrum, there are times where you may not realize it, but we'll be working on a really hard policy issue, we'll be listening to a really hard story, or we'll having to go through some of these horrible cases. Even Epstein's one of them. And you yourself need to take a breather. I catch myself doing this. And faith is the opportunity to recenter about why you're doing this work, and realizing that God gave us the tools. And I feel this about you, probably feel the same way about a lot of people in our space. I think God has given us the tools and the motivation to go forward in this fight. And I think he's given it to more of us than there are on the evil side of this spectrum. So I always say, faith is a vital part of restoration for survivors. It's a vital part also, though, of how we fight this. It's a vital part of making sure that we're spiritually guided and we're able to stay confident in this fight, that we're not alone, and that, in fact, we make up the majority. The bad guys are the majority and the minority.
I like that, Frank. We should end on this note. I want to say to you, we thank you. I mean, your work reminds us that human trafficking is not just a headline, right? It's a human crisis happening not only in America, happening across the globe. We recognize that. It's right in plain sight in all of every town, city, and community all over America. We have to address that, acknowledge it, and then work on that together. We believe awareness at the Warriors is the first step. Real change happens when families, churches, communities, and citizens unite, truly collaborate, and decide we are going to keep our children and everybody safe. And dignity. Everybody deserves dignity. And I believe, Frank, everybody in 2025, we have a moral responsibility. The days of doing nothing but complaining, not everybody has to march on Washington or create nonprofits, but you can participate. Everybody can do something. And even if they share our discussion and leverage their platforms for good by sharing this, that's good enough. We just want people to talk about it, be aware of it, and take a little action. So to everybody watching, that's your call to get educated, to stay alert, and learn the signs, and support organizations like CPAC, and talk to your kids and share. Just keep sharing open and honestly. Don't let strangers, the predators, win, because action saves lives. Frank Russo, you are truly a warrior. All of your information will be in the body of the video. Thank you, because together we're the resistance against exploitation. I'm just honored to know you.
Thank you for the time. And your work is just so vital, and I'm honored to be included in it. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. We'll speak again soon.